It started as just another late-night interview on The Tonight Show, until Jimmy Fallon's laugh died mid-sentence, and 30 Rock Studio 6B became the quietest place in New York City. The cameras were rolling, the audience was buzzing with their usual Tuesday night energy, and the Roots were setting the perfect mood with their signature blend of hip-hop and late-night magic. Oscar Isaac sat across from Jimmy's iconic desk, looking effortlessly cool in a charcoal suit that caught the studio lights just right. They'd been talking about his latest film, diving into the usual territory of method acting, intense preparation, and the physical demands of transforming into complex characters. Jimmy was in his element, that infectious laugh punctuating every other sentence, as he leaned back in his chair, gesturing animatedly with his hands. "So, Oscar, I have to ask about the makeup process," Jimmy said, his eyes already crinkling with anticipated humor. "I mean, some of these transformations you do are insane. Do you ever look in the mirror and go, 'Who is this guy?'" The audience chuckled knowingly. They'd seen the clips, the before and after photos, the time-lapse videos of Oscar disappearing under layers of prosthetics and paint. It was familiar territory, comfortable ground for a late-night interview. Oscar smiled, that enigmatic smile that had charmed audiences for years. "You know, Jimmy, it's funny you ask that, because—" He paused, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not enough for the cameras to catch immediately, but enough for someone paying attention to notice. There was this one time, working with a young actor, maybe 8 years old, and the makeup transformation was particularly intense. Jimmy nodded encouragingly, already anticipating a funny story about child actors and their reactions to movie magic. "Oh, kids and makeup, they must have some wild reactions, right?" "This little boy," Oscar continued, his voice taking on a slightly different tone. "He was getting this really elaborate aging makeup done. We're talking hours in the chair, full prosthetics, the works, and about 3 hours into the process, he looks at himself in the mirror and asks the makeup artist." Oscar's voice caught just slightly, so briefly that most people missed it. He asks, "Will my daddy recognize me?" Jimmy's laugh started to bubble up automatically, the way it did when he sensed a punchline coming. But something in Oscar's eyes made him pause. The studio lights reflected off unshed tears, and the laughter died in Jimmy's throat. "The thing is," Oscar continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly across the silent studio. His father was deployed overseas. Military. And this little boy, he hadn't seen his dad in 8 months. He was so excited because his father was supposed to come home the day after we wrapped filming. The audience, still expecting the punchline, began to quiet down. You could feel the energy in the room shifting, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air becomes heavy and expectant. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his professional instincts telling him to keep the conversation light, but something deeper recognizing that this moment required something else entirely. "Oh," he said softly. "The makeup artist. She's this amazing woman. Been in the business for 30 years. She immediately understood what he was asking. Oscar continued. She knelt down next to his chair and said, "Honey, this is just pretend. Tomorrow you'll look exactly like you again." And this little boy, he just nodded and said, "Good, because I want Daddy to see me, not the movie character." The silence in Studio 6B was now complete. Even the Roots had stopped their usual between-segment noodling. 300 audience members held their breath, sensing they were witnessing something far removed from typical late-night entertainment. Jimmy set down his coffee mug, the one with Daddy written in his daughter's handwriting, that he always used during interviews, and did something unprecedented. He stood up from behind his desk, walked around it, and sat down in the guest chair next to Oscar. "What happened when his father came home?" Jimmy asked, his voice stripped of all performance, all television polish. This was Jimmy Fallon the father, not Jimmy Fallon the host. Oscar looked at him, and for a moment, 2 men in expensive suits, sitting under bright lights became something much more human, The kid's father didn't come home. Jimmy. The words hung in the air like smoke. In the control room, producers who had been monitoring social media feeds and planning the next segment found themselves staring at their screens, forgotten. There was an incident, Oscar continued. The day before the father was supposed to return, we found out during our last day of shooting. And this little boy, he was in full makeup again, and when his mother came to tell him, Oscar's voice broke completely. Jimmy reached out without thinking and placed a hand on Oscar's shoulder. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. It was just one human being recognizing another's pain. He looked at himself in the mirror, Oscar whispered, and he said, "Maybe it's better this way. Maybe Daddy won't have to see how sad I am." In the audience, a woman in the third row brought her hand to her mouth. A man in the front row wiped his eyes with his sleeve. This wasn't television anymore. This was life, raw and unfiltered, happening in real time. Jimmy sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. How did you finish the scene?" "We didn't," Oscar said. "The whole crew just stopped. The director called it a day. Everyone went home. But first, the makeup artist, she sat with that little boy for 2 hours, slowly removing every piece of prosthetic, every bit of paint, until he looked exactly like himself again. And she told him, 'Your daddy will always recognize your heart, sweetheart. That never changes.'" Jimmy nodded slowly, and when he looked up at the camera, his eyes were bright with tears. "You know what, folks?" he said to the audience, his voice steady but completely transformed from the jovial tone that had started the segment. "Sometimes we forget that the people making our movies, they're not just creating entertainment, they're taking care of each other." He turned back to Oscar. "That makeup artist, she sounds like an angel." "She was," Oscar said. "The little boy kept a piece of the prosthetic, just a small bit. At the funeral, he put it in his father's casket. He said it was so his daddy would know he was brave enough to play pretend, but real enough to say goodbye." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. It was the kind of silence that happens when people recognize they've witnessed something profound, something that will stay with them long after the credits roll. Jimmy slowly stood up and walked back to his desk, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against it, facing Oscar and the audience. "Oscar Isaac, everyone," he said quietly. "Not just an incredible actor, but someone who reminds us that the most important performances happen off camera." The applause that followed was different from typical talk show applause. It was the sound of recognition, of gratitude, of people acknowledging that they'd been part of something real. As the show went to commercial, Jimmy did something he'd never done before. He walked over to the audience, found the woman who had been crying, and simply said, "Thank you for caring." Because sometimes, that's all any of us can do. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to soften the moment. Social media exploded with responses from viewers sharing their own stories of loss, of children's wisdom, of the unexpected grace found in the most unlikely places. The child actor began trending worldwide, not as a hashtag of entertainment, but as a symbol of how we hold space for each other's grief. 3 weeks later, Jimmy received a letter. It was written in crayon, in the careful handwriting of a child. "Dear Mr. Jimmy, my name is Danny, and I am 9 years old. I saw you on TV with the movie man who told the story about the little boy. My mommy died last year, and sometimes when I look in the mirror, I don't want to look like me because it makes me too sad. But when I saw you hold his hand on TV, I thought maybe it's okay to look sad sometimes. My teacher says you probably won't read this, but I wanted to say thank you for not laughing when it wasn't funny. Love, Danny." Jimmy read that letter on air the following week, with the child's permission and his grandmother's blessing. He didn't make jokes. He didn't try to lighten the mood. He simply read it, slowly and clearly, and then said to the camera, "Danny, If you're watching, you look perfect exactly as you are, and your mommy would want you to see your beautiful face every single day. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters to Jimmy became a movement, where children and adults alike shared their stories of loss, of identity, of the masks we wear, and the courage it takes to remove them. The show received over 50,000 letters in the following month. Oscar Isaac, meanwhile, found himself changed by that night as well. He began visiting children's hospitals between film projects, not as a celebrity making appearances, but as someone who understood that sometimes the most important audience is an audience of one. He would sit with young patients during their medical procedures, telling them stories, helping them understand that bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and showing up anyway. The makeup artist from Oscar's story, though she had passed away years before, became the inspiration for a foundation that provides support to military families during deployments and grief counseling to children who lose parents in service. Oscar and Jimmy both became ambassadors for the foundation, which they named Beautiful as You Are. 6 months after that episode aired, Jimmy interviewed a military psychiatrist who specialized in helping children cope with parental loss during deployment. The doctor said something that stuck with everyone in that studio. Children have an incredible ability to separate their identity from their emotions when they need to survive. That little boy's question about whether his father would recognize him wasn't really about the makeup. It was about whether love survives transformation, whether we remain lovable when grief changes us. Jimmy nodded, understanding now why that story had affected him so deeply. As a father himself, he knew the fundamental fear that every parent tries to shield their children from. That love might be conditional on staying exactly the same. That change might make us unrecognizable to those we need most. The episode became required viewing in several film schools, not for its entertainment value, but as an example of how authentic human connection can happen anywhere, even under the bright lights of a television studio. Students analyzed the moment Jimmy left his desk, the significance of physical proximity in emotional support, the power of witnessed grief. But perhaps the most profound impact was quieter, more personal. In homes across America, parents had conversations with their children about loss, about identity, about the difference between who we are and who we pretend to be. Makeup counters at department stores reported children asking questions about temporary versus permanent changes, about whether their parents would still love them if they looked different. The Tonight Show's ratings that week were the highest in 5 years, but Jimmy never spoke about the numbers. Instead, he kept Danny's letter in his desk drawer, along with hundreds of others, as a reminder that sometimes the most important job of entertainment is simply to acknowledge that pain exists, that children carry burdens they shouldn't have to carry, and that love, real love, recognizes us no matter how we're disguised. Oscar Isaac later said in interviews that the story he shared that night wasn't planned. He hadn't intended to become so vulnerable on national television. But something about Jimmy's presence, about the safety of being heard without judgment, had unlocked a memory he'd been carrying for years. That little boy taught me something that no acting class ever could, Oscar reflected. That authenticity isn't about method or technique. It's about the courage to be seen. And somewhere, in a small town, where a young boy once worried about being recognized by his father, there stands a memorial garden. The local theater group performs there every summer, and they always begin each show with the same dedication. For those who show us that love sees through every disguise, and for those who teach us that our truest face is the one that dares to grieve. The makeup artist's words echo in that space. Your daddy will always recognize your heart, sweetheart. That never changes, because some truths are too important for television. And some stories are too sacred for anything but the careful, loving retelling they deserve. It wasn't just late-night television. It was a reminder that our scars, real or prosthetic, tell the story of how bravely we've loved, and how courageously we've let ourselves be loved in return.